Good evening from Israel and welcome to Israel Insider with me, Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum. Last week, there was a lot of foreboding about the possibility of an attack by the US on Iran during the height, let's say to a certain extent, of the protests there. There was a lot of expectation, not just in Iran, but also in Israel. A lot of people were worried that it could happen any point, that we would be one of the first targets after the US attacked Iran, and people were starting to get their shelters ready, as I spoke about last week, and then nothing happened. And the big question that many people around the world, especially when President Trump gets involved, is exactly what happened. Were they ever going to attack? Was this real? Was it not? And why didn't they attack? The first thing that really I should say, which I'll deal with a little bit later, is they still might attack. And we certainly see signs for that. A lot more US military assets are being moved to the region, aircraft carriers, refueling planes from different bases around the world. So a lot of military hardware is being moved to the region, US military hardware, I should say, to the regions. Now there's a feeling that perhaps it could take place at the weekend, but again, until it happens, we don't know. As we know, President Trump is in Davos at the World Economic Forum's annual event there, meeting with lots of world leaders. Probably any other leader in the world, you'd say, well, he wouldn't want to attack at such a public, when he's on such a public stage with all these other world leaders who are probably warning him this and telling him that, but that's not President Trump, so it really could happen at any time. The second theory was that the Arab states, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and others warned the US off. It's unlikely, first of all, that President Trump would be completely swayed by that. I'm sure, as I spoke last week, that there was concerns from Arab states. They know that they're in the firing line, especially Saudi Arabia, UAE, and others. Probably less so Qatar, apart from the US base there, because they have better relations with Iran. But certainly the destabilization of the region, any war, you never know what's going to happen. And there was certainly, raised concern about, war, conflict, destabilization. Prices perhaps will be played into that, shipping lanes, et cetera, and Arab states warned President Trump. As I said also last week, the Arab states have to look as much as possible in the face of Iran that they do not want this, because they want to say they've nothing to do with this. They're not helping in any way. In fact, the opposite is true. They're actually trying to push the Americans back from the brink. So that narrative is there. I don't think it's really a reason, but certainly that was one of the opinions spread this week. The third one was Israel was not ready defensively and asked the US not to strike, either to delay it or not to do it at all, because they don't have the defensive munitions which would, be able to react to Iran's potential volley of ballistic missiles. Iran has threatened a response far more than happened during the 12-day war last summer. And it's certain that they have a lot more if they want to use it. And if they feel that they're threatened, they could very well overwhelm parts of Israel's defense for a certain amount of time. And that is certainly a concern in Israel. But again, there is a feeling that, yes, that is a concern. And obviously, Israel would like to be more prepared. But that, again, is not the real reason, because the benefits of knocking out the Ayatollah regime would be far greater than anything that they could inflict on Israel. What is probably the most likely reason, again, suggestions are that this came from Jerusalem, are that the US possibly didn't have the right plan at that point of time. Some of the planning that went into it would have been shared with allies like Israel, probably primarily Israel in the region, and Israeli strategists would have maybe said to them, these targets will cause a lot of damage, but they won't achieve the effect and the goals that you've laid out, which perhaps is, if not regime change or getting rid of the current Ayatollah regime, at least dealing it such a blow that the final fatal blow can be dealt on the ground by the repressed Iranian public. What has apparently happened since then is that President Trump has asked his advisors for really a plan that would bring some sort of decisive blow. And that was reported in the Wall Street Journal, came from a good source. So the assumption is that that is what they've been working on for the last few days. And perhaps the moving many military assets to the region is basically to try and at least give President Trump all options available. Perhaps the decision has been made, perhaps it hasn't yet been made, perhaps it's a way of trying to put pressure on the Iranians. So far, that's not working because the Iranians themselves, the leadership, are basically threatening. That's the way Iran deals with these things. Behind the scenes, something different could be happening. We do know that the Iranians, last week did send a message to U.S. Middle East envoy Witkoff, basically telling him that that there would be no executions because that was one of the red lines President Trump gave. So it's clear the Iranians are worried about it. It's clear that their public saber rattling is not necessarily what's going on behind the scenes. But one thing is clear, that there is intention. There is a lot of military hardware which is coming to the region or is even in the region. And, it wouldn't be the biggest surprise in Israel if something were to happen in the next few days. But again, that's something that we thought last week as well. We do know, again, the Israeli military is the highest state of readiness. The IDF chief of staff, very symbolically, was at an Air Force base talking with those who were involved with attacking Iran during that 12-day war. And basically talking up the achievements and saying that we are ready for anything that anyone throws at us. But also what we do know is there is extremely close coordination between the chief of staff, the IDF chief of staff, and the head of U.S. CENTCOM in the region. There are daily discussions and I'm sure briefings, and I'm sure they're both on the same page. And the likelihood that Israel won't be caught by surprise if there is an attack, because as we've said before, Israel is likely to be a subsequent target from Iran. Again, everything depends on the level and ferocity of the attack, but definitely Israel is ready as much as it can be for what comes next. The big question that many people are asking is, what is the connection between what Donald Trump is doing in the region, in the Gulf, and the so-called Board of Peace, which has been talked about quite a lot in Israel and around the world over the last week, with all these nations being invited to join this Board of Peace. Apparently the Vatican as well, the Pope was invited. They haven't yet decided. But what some analysts are trying to point to is that Donald Trump is really trying to a certain extent, rebuild the world order, especially its infrastructure, its international infrastructure. Some say that he's trying to get at the UN, the United Nations itself. Basically, Donald Trump has never been a big fan of United Nations. He feels that it's a failing organization. It's even a dangerous organization. Only a couple of weeks ago, he took US out of, I think, 36 organizations, and he's defunded others. We know that the US is one of the biggest funders of the UN, and clearly it's something the UN is worried about. Basically, what Donald Trump is supposedly trying to do is build a substitute for the UN in the so-called Board of Peace. And the connection to Iran is that on the one hand, while he will try and solve conflicts in parts of the world, in others, like he did in Venezuela, if military might needs to be shown, then it will be shown. And peace through strength seems to be the order of the day. But the remarkable thing is that there are, I think maybe a couple of dozen countries that have signed up or about to sign up. We saw a volley of Arab and Islamic nations sign up: Pakistan, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, a few others. We don't see many Europeans. We know that there's historical reasons for that, the attitude, especially towards Donald Trump. But a lot of it's also got to do with the whole discussions around Greenland, that the EU is feeling very isolated about that, especially, Denmark is a NATO country. Even though President Trump said from the Davos stage today in quite lengthy hour-and-a-half speech that he will not use military might to take Greenland, but he still wants Greenland. And we know some of the other comments he made about it. The Europeans have certainly put them off this Board of Peace, where he's going to chair it. And apparently, according to some estimations, that basically he is got a veto over many things, and he has a position as the chairman of the Board of Peace as long as he wants to. We know the Board of Peace, basically, if you want to join, you can join, I can't remember if it's 2 or 3 years, but if you want to become a permanent member, you have to put in $1 billion. I'm not sure how many countries have actually done that, but we have seen quite a number of countries sign up. As I said, the only country in Europe is Viktor Orban's Hungary, who is a great admirer and ally of the US, but the Europeans at the moment are trying to consolidate a coordinated opinion on that. Also today, during the lengthy President Trump's speech, he also referred to the next phase of the Gaza peace plan. And I should go back to the Board of Peace. What's most interesting about the outline of this Board of Peace is it doesn't mention the word Gaza, it doesn't mention the word Palestinians or anything like that. And there is a feeling that this is far bigger, that President Trump wants this Board of Peace to deal with Gaza first, but certainly not end there, and to try and deal with lots of conflicts around the world. But the first part of business is really to try and get to phase two. Phase two involves, as we've said many times recently, Hamas's disarmament. And basically, when asked about that, Donald Trump said he thinks that we'll have an answer, as he put it, in the next day or so. And I'm prepared to give Hamas 2 to 3 weeks. And if they do not disarm by then, maybe not disarm, but at least make the declaration they're going to disarm, then hell will be to pay, or whatever language that he used. The feeling in Israel, again, is, as it always has been, that Hamas will not disarm. Perhaps if they're really pressured, they'll do some sort of symbolic disarmament, but the idea that they're going to disarm willingly on their own, or someone else is going to disarm them in Israel, is just not seen as realistic. And the IDF is drawing back up plans, if it hasn't already drawn them up, basically to do that disarmament themselves. Perhaps when President Trump has run out of patience with Hamas, which it seems to be he's going to give them 2 or 3 weeks. Interestingly, tonight, there's been quite a lot of activity on Israel's northern border. The IDF struck at least 4 positions on the Lebanon-Syria border, specifically where weapon smuggling was coming in from Syria to Lebanon, which shows, again, despite the fact that the Assad regime is no longer with us, which was an ally of Iran, and a lot of weapons came through that border, it's clear that this weapon smuggling goes on. And that's why Israel decided to strike at this moment, specifically there. In a wider lens in Syria, there's obviously a lot going on there that's of certain concern to Israel. We've seen in the past that Israel's intervened when the Druze were attacked. This week, we've seen activity by the Ashara government against the Kurds, probably at least in part at the behest of Ankara. Obviously, there's a long-standing grievances that Ankara have against the Kurds, which occupy territories to the north of Syria on the Turkish border, but they're certainly been pushed back, the Kurds, at this point. Israel has not entered in the way that they did with the Druze, but they're certainly keeping an eye on this. They do have ties with the Kurds, but at the moment, Israel is kind of sitting it out. There's still discussions on the sort of security understandings between the Syrian and the Israeli government. Closer to home, once again, the Haredi enlistment issue comes to the fore. As I've mentioned many times, this is a crucial issue. With everything else going on in Israel and in the region, the Haredi enlistment law, or non-enlistment law, I should say, really is the defining point in this government to see how long it lasts. We just heard in the news, there were these recordings of the spiritual leaders, the rabbis who tend to be on these ultra-Orthodox parties' religious councils, basically saying that the enlistment law is a bluff. It's not going to enlist anyone. The idea is to basically try and hold off as much time. It's really not doing what it's supposed to, and not one ultra-Orthodox Israeli will be enlisted. And that has obviously caused a lot of consternation. Meanwhile, Netanyahu is trying to secure his majority. When the vote comes up, according to the cabinet secretary, Yossi Fuchs, the law can come up in the next 2 or 3 weeks, can pass through its second and third readings. And ahead of that, Netanyahu has been driving towards that majority. It's a complicated situation, but as we know, the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox party, as well as the Sephardi ultra-Orthodox party, are currently out of the coalition. But remarkably, being out of the coalition doesn't mean you can't appoint someone to the government, and a deputy minister of communications was appointed from the Hasidic part. I know this is a bit complicated in inside baseball, but from the United Torah Judaism, the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox party is split into two. One is the Hasidic, and one is the non-Hasidic Lithuanian, as they call it. Part of the Lithuanian is usually less extreme than the Hasidic, and at the moment, the majority of seats go to the Hasidic wing, which would be more problematic to vote in favor of the enlistment law. So what was done is the deputy minister was given to a member of the Hasidic wing, and that means he left his position in the Knesset, and the next person in line was remarkably someone from the Lithuanian wing who's far more likely to vote for the bill. So this maneuver, this political maneuver, has bought Netanyahu one more vote for when this law comes up, and that could be crucial. And when this law comes to the Knesset plenum for its second and third reading, which, as I said, could happen any week, he's looking more and more likely that he'll be able to pass it. But there will certainly be even more outrage from the public. One final interesting political event was we have Eisenkot, the leader of a new party called Yashar, break off from Benny Gantz's blue and white party, who took almost all the votes of Benny Gantz. And we talked last week how Benny Gantz tried this new maneuver of basically saying he doesn't want to be put in the Bibi and the non-Bibi or the against Bibi camp. And basically, he stole a lot of the headlines and tried to gain some momentum to push him back over the electoral threshold. Well, Eisenkot has tried something of his own. He wants to create a mega party, as they're calling it, between him, Lapid, and Bennett. Interestingly enough, Lieberman was left out, who would be relatively obvious to be part of that, but Lieberman has a bad experience of running on joint lists. It's almost certainly not going to happen, certainly not at this point. Both Lapid and Bennett would love Eisenkot to join them, but at the moment, they're not going to join Eisenkot, but it certainly steals the headlines and makes Eisenkot seen as someone who wants to do what's best for Israel and puts them in a little bit of a position. Neither Bennett or Lapid have responded. They want this idea to die down and just die out because it's not something which they can come out really smelling like roses at all, because you can't turn down an idea of unity. It doesn't look good, especially when that call to unity comes with it the idea that could swing the elections. I'm not personally a fan of parties joining together. It very rarely works. You're usually more that the sum of the parts is greater than the part itself. I think that's been true of Israeli politics for many years. So I think it's more just a sort of a political stunt, a PR stunt, than anything real. But it certainly does shake things up once again in the Israeli political scene. And with that, I'm happy to go to questions. The first one is from Rachel Mand. Do you think Qatar and Turkey will stay on the border peace? I think the one that's most likely to pay that $1 billion entry fee is probably Qatar. They want to be there and they want to be permanent. If it's going to be something like, the UN Security Council permanent members, then I'm sure Qatar will pay a lot more than that to stay on. But I don't see any reason why they would leave. At the moment, if they're dealing with Gaza, both Qatar and Turkey have been accused as fans or members of the Muslim Brotherhood. They certainly want to have a strong say. They want a seat at the table for anything to do with Gaza. So I don't think there's any particular problem with them staying on the border peace. It only gains for them. Both of them have very good relations with Donald Trump, and they see that Israel is now joining. Palestinians, to the best of my knowledge, have not been invited. So Qatar and Turkey will feel that they are representing the Palestinian point of view. So I do not see them leaving anytime soon. Eric Burney asks on a similar note, why would Israel accept Qatar and Turkey on the border peace? Quite simply because it's not Israel's to accept. It's clear that this is Donald Trump's gambit. It's his game. And as I said, it's way beyond Gaza. Gaza wasn't mentioned. The Palestinians weren't mentioned in the drawing up of this border peace. The invitation letter that was sent around to all these leaders basically laid out the guidelines, some sort of a constitution of the border peace. And the word Gaza and Palestine does not appear once. So Israel does not have a veto. I'm sure Israel has their concerns, and there was talk of Foreign Minister Gideon Saar speaking to his counterpart, Secretary Rubio, when this was announced. But at the end of the day, I think in Israel, they understand that this is Donald Trump's move. This is Donald Trump's board, and Israel has to get on board, be part of it. You don't want to be on the outs. You don't want to annoy President Trump, especially at this point, and you want to have some influence. But it's clear that Netanyahu doesn't have enough influence or didn't want to use political capital to make too much of a fuss about Qatar and Turkey joining the board. Question from Andy Palek. Is it your sense that Israel will participate or even lead militarily in an attack on Iran? I don't believe that Israel will lead militarily. This will be a U.S. strike. I mean, one never knows. It could be a surprise Israeli attack, but I think more than likely this will be a US-led attack if it happens. I think Israel will only get involved physically if it's attacked. I think, first of all, the US has all the hardware it needs. If it is moving all these assets to the region, it will have all the necessary pieces in place really to do just as much, if not more, than Israel could do. Perhaps becomes more politically and diplomatically challenging if Israel is alongside the Americans. Although I think if Iran starts attacking Israel, we won't have a rehashing of the 1991 Gulf War, where I think it was George Bush Sr. who asked then Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir not to get involved while the US was attacking Baghdad, Iraq, even though the Iraqis were attacking Israel at the time. So it could be that Israel will participate, but it's extremely unlikely that it will lead. Andy Palek also asked, what is the backstory for Gantz to say he would sit with Netanyahu in the next government? I dealt with this last week in more detail, but just to sum up, he's floundering in the polls. He's below the electoral threshold. He's, basically polling at 0 at this moment. He needs something. He believes that this call for unity to basically not discount Bibi, even though he said, I'm going to try and bring down this government. But if there is a deadlock and, the other option is to go to elections or rely on one of the extremist parties, either from the far right or the Arab parties, Gantz has said that he does not want that. And he's actually released quite a few videos to show that we shouldn't rely on either Ram or the Arab parties or Itamar Ben-Gvir and the far right. So it's really a political gambit. I wouldn't be surprised if there's some coordination with Netanyahu, but at the moment, Gantz is flailing in the polls. So he needed some big idea to try and make him relevant again. Is it true that Netanyahu will be arrested when the war is over? I don't really know what you're referring to, talking about internationally or in Israel. Basically not in Israel. He's already standing trial, and in this week, once again, like every week, he was in court answering questions, or he's there every day. The court cases, the 3 court cases carry on, and they will not be finished with appeals and everything else for many, many years. Internationally, he can only be arrested if he travels abroad. That was that was the reason why Netanyahu this year did not go to Davos, and Israel's representative was President Isaac Herzog, because Netanyahu is worried that if he travels to Switzerland, I think they may be a member of the ICC. I wouldn't be surprised if they are. I'm almost certain they are. And then they have an obligation to arrest him. Final question, is Hamas rearming? This is from Stephen Miller. Is Hamas rearming rather than disarming, perhaps via Egypt? Well, it's interesting because today we had an episode where Israel basically attacked a car of Palestinians that were supposedly working for Egypt's rehabilitation program, and the Egyptians are extremely angry about that. They want to know exactly what was going on. Israel's, the IDF checks these things in detail, but at first glance, they say that these Palestinians were using Hamas equipment, and that's why they were targeted, regardless of what ostensibly their day job looked like. Once again, we might be seeing, and again, this is only the first initial investigation, we might see once again, Hamas using international humanitarian aid organs and organizations and countries basically to try and shield what perhaps could well be a rearmament. They're certainly trying to rearm, and that is the big worry in Israel. Although it's unlikely that they'll get too much heavy weaponry, Now that Israel is in Rafah, the Rafah crossing is not open between Gaza and Egypt. The Egyptians want it open, but Israel at this point is refusing. And basically, tunnels, a lot of the tunnels, especially to the outside world, are closed, destroyed, or Israel is at those tunnels. What's interesting that is happening is that there is a lot of arms smuggling from the Egyptian border into Israel and then basically make its way into Gaza through some of the Bedouin clans in the south. That is something which is certainly a concern for Israel. We are talking about relatively light weaponry, but as we know, October 7th was conducted with relatively light weaponry. So it is something that Israel's concerned. That seems to be the porous border at the moment between Israel and Egypt. There seems to be this new tactic of using drones to basically bring weapons across the border to the Bedouins, and then they either some of them stay in the Bedouin areas where there's been an uptick in violence, but much of it also is making its way to Gaza. And I think that's all we have time for this week. Thank you very much, those in attendance and those who asked the questions. And I wish you a good day, good evening from Jerusalem. Thank you.